Hi, welcome to Lesson 8 of Fiction and Poetry. Now we're going to talk about structure. I know we talked a little bit last lesson about the structure of the poem and the way that we can use that. Let's really get into it this time though. So first we're going to start off by talking about the line, okay? So the basic building block of prose is the sentence. The basic building block of poetry is the line. So this is something that you definitely need to keep in mind. Just as you would use a sentence in prose, you're going to use a line in poetry. You're going to set some information apart. You're going to talk about it kind of separately, but then you're going to put it into that stanza or paragraph, right? So keep in mind that poetry, just as in all literary works, is to be interpreted by the reader. So the importance of your line is just as important as the sentence that you would normally put into your prose. So let's take our example that we use in the lesson. This is clean your room. I know, a very simple sentence, but we can take this in multiple ways. So take a look at that first example. We have clean your room. Now this could be taken in multiple ways. We could either be giving a command, okay, clean your room, or we could be making a statement about your room. We could be saying that it is clean, right? There are different ways of saying this. Let's look at the next one. We have clean your room. Far more poetic, right? We definitely bring a lot of emphasis to clean your, and then even more emphasis to the word room because it is on a line all by itself. Think of it this way also. If we want to bring even more emphasis to a line, we're probably going to boldface that word, or we might put it in all capital letters. There are multiple ways of doing this since this is poetry. Also, look at the lines. Do you see any punctuation? The poet has chosen not to put in any punctuation. Now let's look at this very last way of putting this. 3 words, 3 lines. Clean your room. Now this is a way that we probably have all heard it said to us, right? This is probably the angry individual. This is the person who is putting emphasis on all 3 words. They are all equally important. Clean your room. Okay? So, as I said before, these create completely different feelings. These show different intentions and tones in the voice when read. Try reading them aloud to yourself. Or try it with a different sentence that you would normally put into a paragraph, or something that you would use as dialogue. Everything changes, right? I could say, she painted the wall. Okay? Let's break it up. She painted the wall. It's different, right? It gets you a completely different feeling. What if we say, she painted the wall? Now we're bringing emphasis to she. This poem might even be set up so that she has its own line each time. Let's continue creating our poem. She painted the wall. She took her time. She was methodical. Now see, when we divide it all up like that, the emphasis is on she. And it's a deeper meaning. We're really paying attention to her, right? Not so much what she's doing, but to her. Now, if we read this in a paragraph form, she painted the wall. She took her time. She was methodical. It sounds like very simple sentences that a child could write, right? This isn't really the way that we want to write. Remember, we want sentences that are more complex when we're writing. However, when we have it in a poem, a simple sentence can come across so much more powerfully, which is the opposite of what we would normally want in fiction, right? This is dependent upon the line. The line is where this all comes together or is all taken apart. This is a perfect way of looking at different ways that we can structure things. Think about that line. It's extremely important. Now, we just created a poem together. However, that's only one stanza, right? Or depending on how you put it on the page, that could be 3 whole stanzas. You can divide each of those sentences, each of those sets of couplets or 2 lines apiece into 3 stanzas. But remember, what is a stanza? It's just like the paragraph, right? We're putting these ideas together. So just as in prose, where ideas are usually grouped together in paragraphs, the lines of the poem are often grouped together into what is called stanzas. Okay, keep this in mind. This is extremely important. So if we're looking at a free form poem, which is a poem that doesn't really have a formulaic way of putting it together, then the length of the line, the stanza, and the poem itself are completely up to the poet. The poet is capable of creating whatever he or she feels like creating and bringing attention to whatever portion he or she feels like bringing attention to. Okay? Let's look at the 2 final stanzas of Robert Herrick's poem. This, of course, is not a free-form poem. This is a poem that is very formulaic. We see a rhyme scheme. We see the stanzas set up in uniform manners, right? Let's look at this. That age is best which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer, but being spent the worse and worst, times still succeed the former. Then be not coy, but use your time, and while ye may go marry, for having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. Let's look at these lines and let's look at these stanzas. Okay, let's take that first line. That age is best which is the first. Okay, we're talking about that very first age, right? Why is this important? Why is first set aside at the very end of that line? Look at the ends of all of these lines. We have first rhymed with worst. We have warmer rhymed with former. We have a very formulaic poem here. And everything is divided up into those stanzas, right? We're talking about age, we're talking about youthfulness, and we're talking about how quickly that joy and that happiness of youthfulness goes away, right? That's all in that, well, second to last stanza in our case. Let's check out that last one. Then be not coy, but use your time, and while ye may go marry. For having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. This is a warning, right? So that very last stanza is a warning to our reader. That stanza by itself, even read alone, is a warning. Even if we hadn't read the rest of the poem, we still kind of get the idea of what the poet is talking about. We understand what the poet is trying to get us to understand, right? Just like in a paragraph. If you're capable of taking a paragraph out of your story, it should be able to stand alone to a point, of course. However, it doesn't usually make as much sense. With fiction, with nonfiction, with any form of prose, we're going to need the rest of the information to really understand what we're talking about. In poetry, we can take an entire stanza and it will pretty much make sense on its own. Usually we are making references to other parts of the poem, but it's so powerful and the wording is so well done that we aren't completely dependent upon that. So keep in mind when you're creating your stanzas and when you're creating your lines, you want to make sure that they can stand on their own because the reader is pausing. Okay? So when the poet fits natural stopping points in a sentence to the end of the line, the reader takes a little pause. Obviously, you can see that. Obviously, you see that in prose as well. So, if we're going to put something that we would naturally pause with at the end of a line, then naturally we're going to pause, right? What if we take part of this and break it up? What if we separate for having lost but once your prime? Okay? What if we separate it right after lost? We'll just take that line. We say, for having lost, but once your prime. Now here, it's a different power. We're emphasizing lost. We're emphasizing prime, right? So this is a completely different way of looking at that line. What if we divide the stanza in half the whole way? Then be not coy, but use your time. And while ye may, go marry. For having lost, but once your prime, you may forever tarry. Now, while these are not as natural of stopping points, they do bring a completely different air to the poem. They get us to focus on different parts that we normally wouldn't focus so clearly on. Try doing this with some of your own poetry, and try doing this with some other poems that you've observed or that you've found yourself. You're going to notice that the poet does set it up so that there is a natural stopping point for you. Pay attention to the line, pay attention to the stanza. Really make sure that you understand why the poet has set it up that way. Because sometimes the poet is trying to get you to understand something that may be a little bit deeper than what's on the surface. Again, remember, this is an artistry. This is something that is not prose. Therefore, it may not be as natural, but it can be just as powerful.